Hello, welcome to the Toledo Museum of Art Sculpture and Blacksmithing Studio. This is the second part of my How to Make Damascus video. The last one I did, I made a 20-layer, what we call billet or chunk of Damascus steel. This is the very same billet. As you can see, it's square. What I did is I heated it up and I forged or hammered it into a square bar, and then I slightly knocked the corners off, and that was in preparation to twist it. I want to show you how to do a couple patterns today, and one of them is a twist pattern. Very simple to do. So you make a square, and how big, we're going to go ahead and start heating that up. So that's, I'm just guessing, that's about 5-inch square, 5/8 inch. So that would be good for a single or a couple bar setup. I'll talk about multiple bar setups, and I brought in quite a few examples to show you as well. Sure, even an inch. I'm going to use a very simple method of twisting it. Just put it in a vise and twist it with the wrench. I've seen some very ingenious ways of twisting this steel, which saves time and energy if you're doing especially a very large bar. Like say, for instance, this handle is 3/4 inch, but if you're doing 1 inch or larger, whether it's plain steel or Damascus, it takes a considerable amount of force, even red hot, just to twist it. So I've seen people do things like take threading machines, metal lathes, etc., old drill braces, the kind of manual drill you'd use 2 hands, and convert them into twisting machines. I never bothered doing that because I kind of like doing it by hand, and I don't make a lot of twists that are really very, very large. If I did, I think I would try that. So what I'm doing is getting it up to a good temperature, a good orange, maybe a low yellow color. I'm going to go over to the vise, clamp it, and like I said, twist it. So here we go, over to the vise. So I think I'll put the handle down, clamp, be able to see it a little better than my twisting wrench on top, and then I literally just twist as many revolutions as I want, as long as it's hot, red to orange color. It's not going to break or affect the strength. As long as my welds are solid, it's not an issue. Now, at this point, it's starting to get to that kind of red, low orange red. Because the steel I started with, I talked about the last one, was it's high carbon tool steel. I don't want to push my luck. If I work it below this color, it will actually crack. I know it will. So I'm going to stop, and I could simply just put it in the forge and reheat it. I'm just going to reach over here and grab a brush so you can see it a little better. So that's just fire scale. So you can see it's not an even twist. The back of the forge is hotter than the front, so this hotter area twisted tighter. Now I could leave that, that's fine, but I want it a little bit more even twist. So I could just throw it back in the forge, but what I found over the years is I usually have a torch in the shop, so why not use a torch as my heat source? What I like about this method is I can just heat the area selectively, just the areas that I want to twist tighter. Now let's do a couple inches at a time. And I'll give it a couple more revolutions, and then I'll do it a little more heating. Now I think this time, as long as I don't get the handles hot, it's okay to leave the wrench on, save some time, and I'll go ahead and heat a little bit more, a couple more inches. As you can see, I'm heating both sides because I want an evenly heated bar, so it twists more evenly. Okay, wrench won't stay on, that's fine. We'll just take it off. So this torch that I'm using is a common oxyacetylene torch with a heating tip, or nicknamed a rosebud tip. Just the last inch or so to do. So I've done, I'm going to show you some samples, but I've done many variations of twists. You can take a simple idea like a twist and do many, many variations of it. Create many, many different patterns, which is something I enjoy doing. Okay, so let's take a look. Pretty good. So it's not, I'm not going to obsess about it, but it's pretty even. Brushing the excess fire scale off so you can see it, and also it helps to clean the metal. Now, that twisting creates an interesting pattern. And that's the whole point of the twisting. It was very popular in the Turkish style of swords. So some people still refer to twisted bar patterns as Turkish Damascus. Kind of got that nickname. But it was also very popular with Viking swords. It's been used in many, many countries. But it's kind of funny how some of those, I'm going to reheat this, some patterns and some things get nicknames. We talked about the nickname of Damascus a little bit last time. So I've got the twist. The twist puts a lot of stress in this steel, so it's good to heat it and then cool it to relieve the stress. But what I'm going to do now is heat it and forge it flat. I can also forge it into a square bar and put multiple bars together to create different patterns. I could have cut it in sections and twist one to the left, one to the right, and put them next to each other to create zigzag or chevron type patterns. In this case, I just want to get it flat. So I'm actually, because of the stress I talked about in the steel, have found it's often good to go ahead and, as I'm going to flatten this, to go ahead and weld it. Just in case any attempt, I'm going to get my glasses, dark glasses, and everything ready. Hammer's ready to go. Shouldn't take very long to heat up. Got my forge running at 2400 degrees. You can see the flux is starting to boil on the surface. It's one indicator that I'm getting close. I go a little bit hotter than that until I see the flux is actually dripping off. Looking for a little sheeting action, and then I'll go ahead and start hammering that together. Okay, so just started sheeting. That's my indicator. It's time to go to the power hammer. Okay, so I'm going to put this on the anvil. Talk about it for a moment and then move on to another pattern. So if you look close, I know it's hard to see, but I can see lighter bands and darker bands or stripes, almost like a candy cane. Think of a candy cane and how it's twisted. I get a striped effect. So the fire scale is actually giving me a hint of the pattern right now. To make the pattern come out fully so you can really see it, I would have to sand it down to 400 or 600 grit. Some people even go to 1000 grit. And then I etch it. And the etching brings out the pattern because they're two different alloys. They etch at different rates. And one has a higher nickel content, so it will be shinier than the other alloy. So I'm going to let that air cool down there. And then we're going to talk about a ladder pattern. So there's twisting and all kinds of things you can do with twists and twisted bars. I'll show you some samples, like I said, in a second. I think it'll make a little more sense. I'll talk more about it then. And then there's two general ways of making a pattern that I wanted to talk about that are pretty straightforward. And from there, I mean, it can get extremely complicated, but you know, we're going to keep it simple for today. So this bar, if you look at it, or billet, is 64 layers, and I've cut notches. I actually measured off lines, and I cut about 3/16 inch deep into the steel. Now you can do that with the milling machine. I actually started with the milling machine, and I cut grooves in the steel. And then my milling machine is not very accurate and very, very slow. So what I ended up doing is switching to an angle grinder, which is very fast. You've seen me use the angle grinder if you saw the Wednesday video. So I switched to the grinder and continue to grind notches. These notches will end up creating the pattern, which is nicknamed a ladder pattern. Now I have 3 notches left to cut. You can see the marker line. Now, a ladder pattern, I think it's a striking pattern, and it's not one that has to like take you several days or weeks to make. It's pretty straightforward. Now I clamp it tightly, and when I made the marks, it was very simple. I just marked out the spacing I wanted, about 1/2 inch, and with the marker I drew a line, permanent marker, and that's all there was to it. So now I'm going to take my grinder, and I'm trying to grind about 3/16 deep for this thickness of the billet. It's about a 1/2 inch thick billet. I don't want to go deeper than that, or by the time I flatten it, which is the next step, the billet would be too thin. So here we go. Okay, that didn't take very long. So, let me point something out. After I ground my notches, and it's a little hard to see, but what I tried to do is put notches so one notch on one side doesn't hit the notch on the other side. They alternate, so they're staggered. One, then one in between, then one in between. I'm going to use my hands to demonstrate. So if they line up exactly, the steel would be too thin by the time I forge it flat. So I do notches like this, like steps, or like a ladder. Now, I did grind the surface flat just to remove sharp edges and any rust or debris that was on this. This is an older billet, it's had a little rust. So my next step is to go ahead and put it in the forge and heat it up and forge it flat. So I've done ladder patterns from like 12, 13 layers up to 500 layers. And it really, I have to think when I'm making the pattern, how do I want the pattern to look? Do I want it very broad and dramatic? Do I want it very tight? How much hammering am I going to do and grinding am I going to do to that steel after I created the billet? Because that will create it will distort or alter or shape and change the pattern as you go. So I have to take those considerations into effect as I'm going. So in this case, I started with about 1/2 inch billets, and then I start doing my patterning work to give myself a thick piece of metal in the end that I have a little bit of fudge room. I have a little bit extra thickness I can work with. Now, just like the twist, I could just hammer this out when it's hot enough, but like the twist, I'm actually going to bring it up to a welding temperature and weld it as I flatten it. I find I get much better results if I do that. Now while that's heating up, this one's, it's over here. There's another billet I have. It's a 160 layer billet, same material, and I forged it to about 3/8 thick, about 1.5, 1 3/4 wide. Now I'm not going to grind into this one. I'm going to use a different method. I made a jig or a tool that's going to pinch indentations in the steel. And then I'm not going to hammer it flat, I'm going to grind it smooth. And by pushing the material, it will create a pattern. When you grind and then hammer flat, you also create a pattern. So there are two ways of creating the same type of pattern. So each one has certain advantages. The advantage of grinding is it's pretty fast. And I can make changes on the fly, and I can, don't have to be straight lines. I can do zigzags. I can do, go at an angle, whatever you want. What I like with the jig method is it's very repeatable. So I can make the same pattern and do several of them, and it's more than likely they'll be very similar, if not the same. Very, very similar. So I'm going to show you that jig in a moment. So now I've reached a good temperature. Oh, it's getting a little hot there. Brush the fire scale off. And apply my flux. Okay, I'm back in the forge. I think I turned up my forge just a little bit too hot, so I'm going to turn the gas down just a tad. That's going a little over 2,500. I really want about 24. Now, same thing. I'll bring this up to welding temp, which the forge got so hot, it's already at welding temperature. It's already ready to go. I'm going to go to the power hammer. The reason I turn the hammer on first, if I remember to, is saves time. Okay, so let's take a look at this. I'm going to set it on the anvil. Now it's subtle, but again, I can see a subtle indication of the pattern. It's still quite hot, obviously, of that ladder pattern coming out. So by hammering it, I hammer till, I think of it as hills and valleys, until the valley reaches the top, the hill is pushed down, and it all obviously becomes flat. That's my goal when I'm hammering, just to get it flat. So that is one basic way of creating a pattern, the stock removal method. You can use a milling machine, you can use a grinder. Very popular one is to take a drill press and drill all kinds of little dots in the steel, and you then hammer it flat, and then it's nicknamed the raindrop pattern. You get little concentric circles. So it can be a wide variety of tools that you could use to grind. I should put that here so it doesn't fall. To grind or remove steel to create your pattern. Now, the other method I was talking about, first of all, let's take a look at my jigs. So I got this idea, honestly, from another smith, and then I adapted it to work for me. The body of this jig is just mild steel, but these little pins, the part that takes a lot of a lot of heat as it's stretching the material, that's actually H13 steel. And you can see they alternate. So as I hammer this together, with the billet inside it, it's going to create a zigzag effect, very similar to the grinding method, except this time, or stock removal method, except this time I'm actually going to hammer the indentations in. So let me start to heat that up. Now, I took the same idea, and I don't have an example with me today, but I wanted to show you the jig. So just to give you an idea, that it doesn't have to all be lines. It can be dots. So what I did is I drilled all mild steel body, I drilled holes, and I did what you call plug weld. These are ball bearings. And I did them in a pattern, so when I compress it, one ball is not on top of another. And this puts nice round depressions in the steel. So remember I was talking about a raindrop pattern with the drill press? This can create a very similar pattern. Now after I do this method, where I bump in or I hammer in the pattern, I then have to grind the stock completely flat. So one disadvantage, although it's very repeatable, is you spend a lot of time grinding. And because you're grinding a lot of material away, you can lose a lot of your Damascus. So you might lose 30 to 50% of your billet, depending on what kind of pattern you're making. One thing I like with this jig and this pattern is sometimes I just run a billet through and just put a few random dots, and I'll follow it with the ball peen and put a few random dots. When I'm done grinding it smooth, it ends up looking like a burl, like a wood grain burl. That's one of my favorite hammer in or bump in type of patterns to make lately. That's been one of my favorite ones. So I think I'm almost up to top. I'm going to remember to put my ear protection on this time. So I need the steel very hot. Tool steel does not like to be worked cold or it cracks every time. So I need to get it real hot, not a welding temperature this time, but a good orange to yellow. Give it a quick brush. I'll take my jig and I'll go to the power hammer. So we've reached temperature. Now, of course, I have to be careful, be aware of where my hand is. So I did get indentations. The steel jumped a little bit in one spot, so I got a couple double marks, which is really a big deal. But the main thing was just starting to get cold. The dies are no longer flat on the power hammer, so it was starting to get what I call a banana shape. So I flipped it upside down. I was trying to correct the shape, and that's when it jumped a little bit, and I got a little bit of what you might call a double stripe. I'll try to correct that a little, but honestly, if it's just a little, it grinds right out anyway, because you're going to grind the surface off, so I'm not concerned about it at all. But I do want to get the depth of the indentation just a little deeper if I can. Now there's a built-in stop in the jig, so I can't hammer it beyond set depth. So I'm going to use a hand hammer just to kind of flatten, straighten things out a little. Then I'll just try a little bit more. Got it. So, this puts a tremendous amount of stress on the steel, similar to the twist and when you manipulate steel like this. So, what I need to do at this point, I found often with this particular pattern, when I hammer in, if I don't do this step right away, I run into problems later on. So it's simple. I need to get it a little flatter anyway. I get the steel hot, red hot, and then I air cool it. It's called normalizing the steel. It returns the steel structure. It's kind of like a reset button. It removes some of that stress in the steel and returns things back to the crystalline structure. Steel has a microcrystalline structure if you were to look at it under a microscope. And it returns the structure back to its normal state, hence the nickname or the name normalizing. It's a common procedure done in blacksmithing and industrial forging. So I'll brush that off a little bit, and especially when I hold it on the edge, you'll see, by the way, it's not magnetic at this point. So I know the color of the temperature. I know the temperature by the color, I should say. But if I check with the magnet, I need to get it, for this normalizing process, I need to get it just beyond the point where it's no longer magnetic. So when you're learning that temperature, you can just use a basic magnet and check it. So you can see it has kind of a zigzag or ravioli noodle kind of effect. That's what I'm going for. So the next step is, after it's cool, I'd grind it completely flat. And that would give me a ladder pattern. Okay, so I think I'm going to let that cool. And actually, I'd like to show you and talk about some samples. So I'm done with the forge right now. I can shut that off. And we can go over to the table on this side, and I'll show you some different patterns. Okay, let me make a little elbow room here. I'm working on several projects, so pardon my mess. Now, first of all, this is just similar to the first twist I did, but this is a bar of, I don't even know how many, I think it's 64, is a question mark, 64 layers that was twisted, and then I forge welded it square. So instead of going flat, I made it square first. Now that I didn't grind or etch. This one I did. The contrast is very subtle though, because this type of steel, the type of steel I use on purpose is very low contrast. They're very similar, so there's not much contrast. You have to look closely at the pad. Now, if I took that and were to flatten it, like the demonstration I did, I would create a pattern like this. And this is one single twist. This one's, I think, 120 layers. Yeah, it's 120 layers, single twist, and flattened. Now, you can take a twist, as I was saying, and do all kinds of combinations. So this is, at my note, something like 120 layers, one single twist, then on the edge or on the side of that bar, for instance, on the side of this bar, I then put a bar of solid tool steel, 1095 tool steel. So I have a twist on the top, and I have a solid steel edge on the bottom. Okay, now, the Turkish, nicknamed Turkish style, Turkish twist, is where you take multiple bars and put it together. Now, that's just one of the nicknames. Not everyone calls it that. So I took, in this case, it looks like 4 bars. Each bar was 184 layers, and similar to the other ones, I was doing this for a while. I welded a solid tool steel bar to the edge. So you have 4 bars and then 1 single bar of non-Damascus, just tool steel. So all those twisted bars were twisted the same direction. One nickname for that, an old nickname, was a maidenhair pattern because of that loose flowing design. Now this one's a little more dramatic. Hopefully you could see this one a little better. So I took a very low count square bar. It was 28 layers. I twisted 1 to the left and 1 to the right. I put 3 of them together, and then the edge I welded the solid bar of tool steel. So I've got what we call a chevron. We got a zigzag pattern. But being very low layer count, it's a much more dramatic pattern. And then this bar, so these are all some of the many variations of twist you can do, is actually 6 bars of Damascus, each one twisted. Now the 4 in the center were something in like 160 layers. No, the outer was 160 layers, so you can barely see the twist. It'll be more pronounced later on. One reason the pattern is so subtle right now is this is what's called a test etch. I just ground it down to about 200 grit, and then I did a quick etch. I used ferric chloride to give me a hint of the pattern. I'll show you some finished pieces where the pattern's more dramatic. I etched it for about an hour, and then the pattern becomes much more dramatic. So I have 4 bars, no, actually 6 bars in the center of a relatively low layer count. I don't remember, something like 36, and the outside much higher. So why do I have this notch? I'm going to close that notch, weld it shut. The outer bars then will line up perfectly to a point. So I did that on purpose. That's in prep for the next step of that particular pattern. Now this one is a totally different idea. It's not a twist. So I took 3 different alloys. You can use more than 2. You can use as many as you want. But I took 2 alloys, welded them together, created 20 layers. Then I took those, and like I initially alternated 5 layers, I alternated that with a fat layer of a different type of steel. So I've got 20 layers, thick layer, 20 layers, thick layer, and so on. Then I turn the whole thing edge up, so my layers are actually going this way. So that's a whole different kind of effect. One thing that's really wonderful about Damascus is the pattern development is really unlimited. It's you know, how far can your imagination take it? So just a simple 23 layers welded together, a large bar. This is not cleaned up, as you can see, just the fire scale. You can see dark and light layers. I made a big chunk and I set it aside. My thought was it would be fun to make a hammer out of this. So I would literally, the next step would be to punch a hole through it. When we make hammers in blacksmithing, we punch the hole through. We don't drill a hole through. It makes a stronger hammer. So this is, I'm set aside to make a hammer someday. This was the random one I showed you yesterday, and I do apologize. I saw the contrast is so low, so subtle, you can barely see it, I realize, but it kind of looks like wood paneling. Now this one, I think you can see, I hope so, it's just a small piece left over from a project. There's a whole nother idea. It's called Canister Damascus. So I took a canister, a steel tube, I welded one end shut, I then filled it with different kinds of metal powder and different types of steel. I then put a little kerosene in it. The kerosene acted as my flux. You have to make sure one end has a little 1/8" hole because you don't want it to accidentally blow up. And then I welded it shut. Then I removed the canister and this was the effect I got in this particular case. So you see lines and stripes. There's also subtle little bits where you have different patterns going on, and then you have dark areas where there is just pure metal powder. So that's a type of canister Damascus. Now, this I think will be much easier to see. So this was one of my older knives. Now these are vegetable cutting knives. They're special chef knives. Now this one is, well, it's a nikiri, or some people would call it an usuba. It's a Japanese type of cutting knife. It's meant for vegetables only. It's very, very thin, as you can see. So it's not, let me show you the back. The back is maybe a little bit more dramatic. And the back, in this particular blade, I did it a fairly traditional style, is I made the back slightly hollow ground, or it's slightly dished. And that helped emphasize the pattern. In this particular blade, I remember I spent a long time, I milled or used the milling machine to cut grooves in. I didn't use the grinder. So the pattern is very consistent with the milling machine. Little side note, it's very subtle, but the ferrule on the handle is 20 layers of copper and brass, also in a ladder pattern. That's done by a whole different process, but another, it's an old Japanese technique. Now this is a combination pattern, relatively high contrast. So what I have, the backbone I'll call it, or the main part of this is a chef knife, a santoku. This is a random pattern, 256 layers, 2 different types of steel. One thing that, to me, that's interesting about that steel is experimenting for a while with the alloy called 6418, or a trade name High Tough. It's the same steel used to make aircraft landing gear. So it can withstand incredible torsion resistance. It has incredible torsion resistance and impact resistance, but it's terrible stuff to work with. It's very, very hard to work with, and to get it to actually weld. Some people didn't even believe I could do it, but I did it, and I'm like, well, that was fun, but I'm not going to do it again. It's too much work, and I lost so many of them that I'm like, that's not worth it. But anyway, and then on the edge, I took one of these twisted bars. I think it was something like 48 layers. A very simple twist, and I actually, by purposely ground through and cut into the center of the bar, I end up then with the repeating star pattern. So that was from an actual twist, the star pattern. And I purposely ground the blade so I would have the star pattern and the random pattern meet nicely at that bevel line. So if you were to just take a simple square twist and literally cut it in half, the inside would be the star pattern. Okay, so these are some very old, actually for me, these are pretty old examples of some of my work, but they're good examples of the types of patterns I was talking about. So I wanted to bring those in and show you. One thing that's fun for me is when I make a chef knife, I always get to test it. So usually I'll make like a stir fry. I actually will chop up ginger, frozen ginger, garlic, squash, whatever I can. I'm vegetarian, so I never use it on meat, but I really put it through its paces, because if I'm going to sell it, it better work. It's got to be strong, and if it's not, I wouldn't sell it. That's just my personal philosophy on that. Now, again, I'll just finish up by saying not everything I make is a knife. I've made plenty of belt buckles and lots of jewelry. I have made many cabochons, or like stone shapes, out of Damascus, and then set them like you would set a gem on a ring or on a pendant or what have you. I've made some into little vessels and dishes. So you can make all kinds of things. I even saw one person make furniture out of it, and I thought, oh my gosh, the amount of time it would take to do that. But it was amazing, fabulous. So you can see I have a passion for it. It's one of my favorite areas in blacksmithing. I really enjoy it. Part of the challenge mystery and fun is the pattern development, to see if I could create a pattern and I experiment, and that leads to another pattern. Sometimes that can be a downfall because I get so excited about the next pattern, I didn't finish the last one I did. And I'm getting better at that, finishing things. But you know what? It's all good, as I say sometimes, because I can go back to this and now I have plenty of material that I can just pull off the shelf and make all kinds of things out of. Okay, so that's I think pretty well summarizes my demonstration. Damascus steel and pattern development. Remember, if you're interested in this, I do occasionally teach classes in Damascus steel making, and you know, so keep an eye out for that. I think we may try some in spring if all goes well. So thank you very much for watching my video. I really had a pleasure doing it. It's always fun for me to work with Damascus and to make these videos. So thank you very much, and happy forging.